Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to learn about the topic called unemployment. To get there, we have to first understand what's the labor force and who's not in the labor force in a few specific groups. And then we're going to look at the people who are employed and the people who are unemployed. So let's get started. Okay, so the first part about unemployment is actually kind of a little bit bigger than just the unemployed people. We're going to start in the top level here where it says civilian non-institutional population age 16 and over. This means that we're not going to deal with any folks who are in the military when we're dealing with unemployment or when we're talking about the labor force. That's because really this measure could be kind of affected if the government were to say draft a whole bunch of people. So we want to leave kind of the military out of this. We know that obviously they have jobs and they do very important jobs, but this is a measure for civilians. Non-institutional means not in jail or in like a hospital of some kind or a nursing home. If you're kind of like institutionalized, is really the best way to describe that, right? And it's 16 years and older. So in the United States, this is about 270 million people. In that group, this 270 million people, there are people who are what we call not in labor force, the people who are in the labor force. These are an or. Not you can't be both, right? So you're either one or the other within that 270 million. Now, within the larger of the two is called the civilian labor force, and that's about 170 million people. These are people who are working for pay, who we would call employed, or they actively look for a job in the last 4 weeks, and that's what we're going to get to with unemployed in a moment. But the other group of people, the other 100 million people or so who are not in the labor force, and you don't have to know these numbers, but I'm kind of giving you them so you have an idea. These are people who are not actively looking for a job, and they're not actively working. So in other words, they don't fit either of these two other categories. Now, within the not in the labor force group, which is what we're going to kind of start with, and we'll circle back to these folks, we would say that the vast majority are kind of what we say others. These are people who are like retired, right? Maybe they're students. These are people who just simply don't want a job right now or are not looking for a job and don't have one. But then within that category, though, there's another group of people who are called what we call marginally attached to the labor force. They're not actually in the labor force. They're just kind of on the penumbra of them. And these are people who, when the surveyor calls, they say, well, I would like a job. So I'm not retired. I'm not a student or something, but I would like one. But I looked in the last year, but not, whoops, my pen's pooping out on me there, but not the last, sorry about my poor handwriting, 4 weeks. So I got a little refill on my pen here. But these are people who in the last year have looked for a job, but they haven't looked in the last month. And so we consider them kind of close to the labor force, right? And they even say, yes, I would like a job. Now, within that category of the marginally attached, there's also these subgroup called discouraged workers. Now, discouraged workers are not actually workers, right? So I left the word workers off because I didn't want you to be confused. But the reason why they stopped looking in the last year was because of poor job prospects. That means they couldn't find a job. And so they stopped looking, which really, once you stop looking, you're no longer unemployed. And so it makes it look like the economy is doing really well if you have lots and lots of discouraged workers, because on the surface level, they won't count as unemployed. They're not technically unemployed. They're not looking, but the reason why they're not looking is because they couldn't find a job. So if you have a huge number of these discouraged workers, it could be kind of a sign that maybe there's something going on in your economy. Now, the kind of big picture division between the 100 versus 170 million, we actually make a calculation of the number of people who are in this labor force out of this civilian non-institutional population, the 170 out of the 270. That's called the labor force participation rate. Another way to say it is just the labor force out of the population, the eligible population. And that rate of kind of the labor force divided by the population is equal to the labor force, LFPR, as a percentage anyways, right? So it's usually 100. Man, my pen is not working. 100 times that. This can kind of tell us about how well are we using our resources in society. And the United States, for example, has had a declining labor force participation rate, along with lots of other countries. And it's a sign of maybe slowing economic growth. So economists keep an eye on that number, that labor force participation rate, because if you have lots of people who are working out of the population, then you're going to grow faster. But if you have lots of people who are not working, then you're going to go slower, right? And so aging populations, for example, countries with lots of retirees, will have lower labor force participation rates. Now, within the labor force itself, there are two groups, again, just like there was within the population, and they are in either or. You're either employed or you're not. You're either unemployed, but you can't be the same. You can't be both at the same time, right? So the people who are employed have people who, when the survey calls, they say, yes, I've worked at least an hour in the last week for pay. These are people who could be self-employed. These are people who could be working for wages or tips or commissions. You could be cutting grass. There are a zillion things, right? It could be illegal work or legal work. It could be stuff you report to the government and stuff you don't. It really doesn't matter what you did as long as you worked for pay, at least for an hour in the last week. Or you were not at work, but you had a job. But you had a job. And so that's kind of the other group of folks who they'll answer the survey. Man, this pen, I'm telling you. They answer the survey question and they say, well, I was on vacation. Well, you didn't work, but you still have a job. Well, I was out sick. You didn't work, but you still have a job. You're on strike. Yeah, you didn't work, but you still have a job. So there's lots of categories of not at work, but you still had a job. And you still would count as employed. Now, within the employed group, and we'll come back to unemployed in a second, there's a subgroup called Peters. Now, Peters are part-time for economic reasons. And what that means, part-time for economic reasons, I think I might have to get another pen. Oh my goodness. Part-time for economic reasons, it means that they're not getting as many hours at work as they would like. And so when they answer the survey, they say, yes, I worked for pay. And then they say, did you have a full-time job? And they say, no. Did you want one? Yes, I would like a full-time job, but there's not enough work for me to have it. Now, if your economy has lots of Peters, then we would say that you're going to look really great because you have lots of employed workers. But at the same time, that's slack again in the economy. Much like this discouraged workers, it could make your economy look like it's doing really well when in fact, maybe there's some weakness there, right? Now, within this unemployed group, let's talk briefly about what this means. To be unemployed, you can't be employed, right? So you can't be both. We already said that. But in addition, you had to actively sought a job. I am going to swap out this pen. Sought a job in the last four weeks. Maybe it's the angle that I'm doing it at there. And so it's really just right up here, right? This actively sought a job in the last 4 weeks. And so these folks have to have put in an application somewhere. They had to have like actually done something, maybe interviewed for a job. You can't just say, oh, no, I was hoping for a job to fall in my lap. And so the moment that you stop looking, the clock starts ticking. And actually, when the 4 weeks are done, you're no longer officially unemployed by our metrics. Now, a lot of students think this is related to unemployment benefits. It's not related to unemployment benefits. It's not at all. And the definition for what you qualify for unemployment benefits is very different. Not related to unemployment benefits. It's really just a separate kind of measure. Unemployment benefits happen for a variety of reasons, and you can be unemployed and not be receiving unemployment benefits, and so it is a little bit of a tricky spot. Now, within the unemployed group, there's 3 subgroups that we're going to learn about in the next lesson. The last thing I want to really talk about is how we calculate the unemployment rate. It is the unemployed number out of the, I don't know why I wrote that backwards, labor force. And again, that's calculated times 100. So the unemployment rate is just the number of unemployed people, this number unemployed out of the labor force. What a lot of students do is they take the unemployed out of the population, which is not correct. The unemployment rate is that, as we said. So I've kind of talked around this, but unemployment rate is useful for thinking about how easy it is to find a job, but it's not the be-all, end-all of everything related to labor forces in the market. It also doesn't necessarily tell you everything you need to know, right? It could overstate or understate the rate. If you have lots of discouraged workers, it might actually make your unemployment rate look really low, but in fact, there's some problems. If you have lots of part-time for economic reasons workers, it could make your unemployment rate look really low, but still have lots of kind of slack, if you will. And then you have discouraged and Peters. And then the last thing to know is that it really doesn't reflect everybody's lived experiences. Unemployment is concentrated among people with lower education levels. It's concentrated among certain ethnic groups. African American and Hispanic Americans are often have higher unemployment rates, and young people have higher unemployment rates than the averages. So thinking about this as kind of describing everybody's experiences maybe be just a little bit too broad. So hopefully this helped you understand the basics of unemployment and the labor force. I'll see you next time.